Right now, Iraq is a training ground for terrorists. Right now, Libya, nobody even knows Libya.
And the world would be better off with Saddam Hussein
100%.
and Gaddafi in power?
100%. It's great to be with the president of Egypt, and I just want to say to you, Mr. President, that you have a great friend and ally in the United States and in me. King Salman, your father would be very, very proud to see that you are continuing his legacy. It's a great honor and privilege, because he's become a friend of mine, to introduce President Erdogan of Turkey. I have President Putin. He just said it's not Russia. I will say this, I don't see any reason why it would be. I like him, he likes me. I guess that's okay. Am I allowed to say that? We fell in love.
President Donald Trump's praise for authoritarian leaders. Our next guests are contributing writers for a new book out today titled Fight for Liberty, Defending Democracy in the Age of Trump, which is a collection of essays that analyze threats to the liberal world order. Joining us are columnist for the New York Times, Bret Stephens, and chairman of both the Renewed Democracy Initiative and the Human Rights Foundation, former world chess champion Garry Kasparov, and former deputy national security advisor to President Obama, Ben Rhodes, and NBC national political reporter Heidi Przybyla rejoins our conversation. Thank you all for being here. It's good to see you. Ben, let me start with you on this story about the Washington Post columnist Jamal Khashoggi. It appears today, according to NBC's reporting, that the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia is going to go out with a story that says he was accidentally killed inside the Saudi consulate in Istanbul. President Trump got out front of the story by mentioning rogue killers early yesterday. Now it looks like Saudi Arabia is going to say it was rogue operatives. What do you make as you watch this?
Well, I mean, first of all, I don't think anybody who's any experience with the Saudis could think it was possible that a team like this of 15 people could go to Turkey on a high-profile mission like this without the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia knowing about it and authorizing it. That is an incredibly centralized top-down leadership. It's become even more so under Mohammed bin Salman. So the notion that this could have been a rogue operation, I think, is unbelievable. And it feels, Willie, like the Trump administration is trying to help them come up with a story to get this out of the headlines. You know, what they want to do is, you know, pull down the temperature and move forward, which I think is a tragic abdication of what we should be doing, which is holding the Saudis to account for squelching dissent like this and putting on the table real consequences, like whether or not we're going to continue to support a war in Yemen that has gone out of control, whether or not we're going to continue to sell arms to a regime that would kill somebody in another country for expressing their views. So I think it's of a pattern of what you showed, which is Donald Trump believes authoritarian leaders when they give him assurances. He doesn't give our allies that same benefit of the doubt.
So in a parallel universe, if you were working on this in previous administration, what would be happening right now? When Mike Pompeo goes to speak to the king, speaks to the Crown Prince, what would you be saying directly to him?
Well, first of all, one of the things that we'd be doing, which is not happening, is mobilizing the rest of the democracies around the world to have a united front on this. You know, we would have U.S. statements coordinated with Europe condemning this and warning of consequences, so that you go into that meeting with a bigger team. And then I think you'd go in and say, you know, we need a full accounting of this. And frankly, number one, there has to be consequences. But number two, even if that accounting comes out, there still have to be consequences to show that we don't stand for this. And so I would be putting on the table, again, very real things like whether or not we continue to support a war in Yemen that has precipitated a humanitarian crisis, and whether or not we continue these arms sales, which feel like a blank check for the Saudis, because they can just give us money, and in return we look the other way when they do anything.
Garry, we played the sort of clips of the greatest hits of President Trump talking about authoritarians around the world. Yes, praising it. And then again yesterday, sort of giving Saudi Arabia the benefit of the doubt, saying he said very strongly it wasn't him, and now we're going to learn today that Saudi Arabia is going to come out and say, in fact, it was us, it was just a mistake.
Yes, I think President Trump famously said that he could shoot someone on the Fifth Avenue and he would not lose support of his base. And I think for him, killing journalists and political opponents, it's probably not a crime. So and somehow I feel that he envies these leaders, totalitarian leaders around the world, that they could do whatever they want, you know, to subdue political opposition.
You know, I think part of the problem here is that we have a foreign policy under Trump, which is supposed to be an interest-based rather than a values-based foreign policy. And I think what you're seeing here is how that literally blows up in America's face, because America is a democracy and we have problems normal Americans have problems supporting a regime that is as brazen as murdering or beheading journalists in their own consulates. So putting values at the center of your foreign policy it turns out to be a central American strategic interest.
Mika?
Ben, I'm just curious because you laid out some of the obvious steps that could be taken in the case of Mr. Khashoggi. But what message do you think the way the president is handling this? We sort of came into the show this morning saying that he was naive. But I think it might be a little bit more destructive and dangerous. Hedging on whether or not they did it or not, almost siding them, sort of not, sowing doubt. What message is that sending to the world, to our strategic partners, and basically in terms of our foreign policy?
Well, I think it's a very dangerous message, Mika. I mean, first of all, the message the Saudis wanted to send, and that they have sent, is that you're not safe anywhere if you criticize us. And frankly, they probably don't mind all of this attention because it's sending that message for them. If you're a Saudi dissident or journalist anywhere in the world, you're thinking twice. And the message that President Trump is sending is that there's no consequences. And what you have to realize is there's nobody else who can play the role of the United States to hold people like this to account. We are the world's oldest and most significant democracy. And if we're not doing this, if we're not standing up for this, there's not somebody else who's going to do that. And the consequences of that are journalists everywhere are less safe. And let's face it, we have a president of the United States who says journalists are the enemy of the state. So values like freedom of speech and dissent suddenly are very endangered around the world. And that's a trend line that I think is getting much worse. And so this vacuum of any advocacy for democratic values, I think is putting people at risk. And there's nobody else who's going to fill that vacuum if the President of the United States and the United States of America is not doing that.
And Gary, in Fight for Liberty, you talk about how at one time the spread of democracy seemed to be unstoppable, and yet we now find ourselves at a place in time where there is a real threat that those democratic trend lines are going to be reversed.
Yes, it's the first time since the end of the Cold War, so we are facing the decline of all indexes of freedom and democracy around the world. It's for more than a decade straight. I think the free world has failed to come up with a strategy, comprehensive strategy of promoting democracy and the values. And as just Brett said, it's a foreign policy of the United States today is just a policy of interest, very often short-term interest, and not of the values that could lead the way. America basically abandoned its role as a global leader of the free world and looks for just for specific interests that sometimes are just contradicting the strategic objectives.
We've also, in the past we've had periods when authoritarian regimes have been strengthening, particularly in the 1930s. But at the time, in the United States, core leadership, Franklin Roosevelt and after him Harry Truman and the succession of American presidents, believed in the values of liberalism and democracy. They're what defined the Western world at the time. And what's so dangerous, I think, about this period is that you have at the core of the West this kind of rot represented in a Trump administration that sees a lot to praise in dictators and not much to praise in democracies.
But I think it's also a result of the long-term policy of appeasement, because Crown Prince could look at Putin and Putin's record of killing his enemies both inside and outside of Russia, and looking at the rise of other dictators. I think it's very important to understand it's some kind of it's a domino effect. If one dictator can do it, then others think, why not? Dictators never ask why. It's always why not. And they saw no consequences. Yes, there's the big hype now about this murder. But from Saudi's perspectives, maybe it could have a positive effect for their strategic objectives, because it could silence some of the potential critics that could be simply afraid.
Joe?
So Gary, talk about, if you will, because we focus, I think, sometimes too much on the impact that Donald Trump's language, his actions will have on totalitarian leaders. You were a citizen in the totalitarian Soviet Union. We heard stories after 1989, after 1991, after the Soviet Union fell, of people that were behind the Iron Curtain actually taking heart from the words of every American president, from JFK at the Berlin Wall to Ronald Reagan at the Berlin Wall. We heard of dissidents that were trapped in the Soviet Union, listening to American presidents' words and believing that the fight was worth it. What is the impact when you have a president like Donald Trump doing the opposite of what JFK did, the opposite of what Ronald Reagan did, and seeming to embrace these authoritarian figures?
Oh, somehow I hope that Donald Trump will have a positive effect in this country, because it's a wake-up call. Because people here ignore the Ronald Reagan's warning that the freedom is always one generation away from extinction. And now with Donald Trump, I think people here are just, slowly getting they're recognizing the fact that these institutions are solid but getting rusty, and it's very important now to look back and to understand what can be done to make sure that Donald Trump and the like will not be elected and will not be discrediting U.S. reputation around the globe.
So, Ben, one of the bottom lines in this story is that this morning we have the American Secretary of State in Riyadh basically telling the Saudi Arabians, we're going to take your story, we're going to help make it a little bit better, a little bit more saleable. Your response earlier was that what should happen now is we should form a strategic alliance of the nations to sit down and hash this out and tell the Saudis they can no longer do stuff like this. My question to you is, what allies? Where are our allies?
Yeah.
Who are they?
Well, at its core, it's our European allies who share...
Who we've insulted.
Who we've insulted, exactly. I mean, and that's what's so damaging, and that's where these pieces connect, is that when you have a Donald Trump who has shown himself much more willing to criticize an Angela Merkel or a Justin Trudeau, when you need those countries, and when you need them to do something hard, standing up to Saudi Arabia, it's harder to build that coalition, and frankly, we're not even trying. But ultimately, look, this is a tough world, and you have a China that is emerging, that is anti-democratic. You have a government in Russia that is seeking to reassert itself in a very authoritarian way. Even with the United States, all our strength, we need a team. We need other people who share our values, who have their own power and influence around the world, to work with us. And frankly, just the other side of the coin of Donald Trump praising all these authoritarian leaders is him saying, even on 60 Minutes the other day, he said, well, I don't even know if they're allies. And he said, I don't know if NATO has been a good bet for us. I don't know if NATO prevented a World War III. Those were his own words. NATO is the core security institution of countries that share values and interests. They're all democracies in NATO, and we're supposed to be standing up for those democratic values, and we're supposed to lead a chorus of voices. One of the great privileges serving in government is when you realize that the United States would comment on something like this case, and you'd feel the Europeans coming behind you, you'd feel Japan coming behind you, and that's what's missing.
So, Ben, you said last night with Chris Hayes that it was a mistake for the Obama administration to back the Saudis in the war in Yemen. We know about the civilian deaths. We know about the famine. We know about the refugee crisis. Is this a good leverage point for the United States to stop backing that war?
I think so. And, our basic approach was we had concerns about the war and we had concerns about the Crown Prince. We thought by giving them some support and then at times pulling that back, so tapping the brakes, putting restraints on certain weapons that went to them, urging them to get in a political solution, that we could influence the direction of events, and we were wrong about that. And the fact of the matter is, when the Trump administration came in, any restraints went off. And all the things that we saw Mohammed bin Salman pressing towards the end of our administration have come to fore. The war in Yemen has escalated. You had that bizarre situation with the Prime Minister of Lebanon essentially being held hostage in Saudi Arabia. You had this roundup of his political opponents in the Ritz. You have this fight with Qatar that has really led nowhere. And frankly, we see him asserting himself in ways that are very potentially destabilizing and frankly, clearly silencing dissent inside of the kingdom. And we have to exert some leverage. The Saudis need us more than we need them. And there's this imbalance in how this is playing out. You would think that they were the superpower, and we're not.
So, Brett, I'll give you the last word here. How does this play out? Based on the rhetoric we've heard from the president yesterday that he believed the denial, based on what we're going to hear from Saudi Arabia reportedly today, that it was all an accident in the middle of an interrogation. What happens here? Does the United States exert any pressure on Saudi Arabia at the end of the day?
My suspicion is that they're going to seek some kind of admission, limited, modified, hangout kind of deal in which they say that we accidentally killed Khashoggi in an attempt to render him back to Saudi Arabia. The problem that the administration has is that it sees the Saudis as a pillar in their overarching desire to stop the Iranians. And as long as the Saudis play that card, they're going to get a lot of leeway from the administration.
It's worth saying one more time. The argument goes from Saudi Arabia, we just meant to kidnap, torture, and interrogate him, and we ended up killing him by mistake. Brett Stevens, Gary Kasparov, thank you both. The book is Fight for Liberty, Defending Democracy in the Age of Trump. It's out today. Ben Rhodes, thank you. Good to see you as well. Still ahead this morning, Defense Secretary James Mattis is fighting off speculation that there's a rift between himself and President Trump. What he told reporters about their relationship and his future in the administration when Morning Joe comes right back.
Thanks for checking out MSNBC on YouTube, and make sure you subscribe to stay up to date on the day's biggest stories. And you can click on any of the videos around us to watch more from Morning Joe and MSNBC. Thanks so much for watching.